So I just want to do an addendum to what David just said, that Shemin also was trying to figure out what to talk on since her district has changed. So I believe, and so maybe at the end of this talk today, we'll all understand that better. I would like to understand it better, what it means for David Tyson Smith and Shemin Swass. So Brianna, our Boone County clerk, is our speaker today. She was elected in 2018 and serves a 4-year term. Brianna's fairly local. She went to Truman State for her undergraduate degree, and she holds a master's in public policy, as well as her law degree from Mizzou. Prior to her election as our Boone County clerk, she worked as an assistant attorney general in the Consumer Protection Division of the Missouri Attorney General's office. And before joining the Secretary of State's office under Jason Kander as the Deputy Director of Elections. So she has a lot of background in this, and it was actually a project called Election Integrity Unit in the Secretary of State's office. Brianna lives in Columbia with her husband and 2 children, Ryan and Isabel, and she's been very active in local affairs for a number of years. I do want to mention that Brianna, I'm now more interested in watching them, does a series of podcasts with her co-host, who is Eric Fay from the St. Louis Board of Elections, on issues like integrity, cybersecurity, voter election. So I'm re-interested. I've seen those announced and taking a look at those. And perhaps we should put those on the announcements next week that they're available. So the last thing I want to mention is that Brianna was, if I can find it in my notes, was recently appointed to, okay, can I find it? To the executive boards of the Missouri Association of County Clerks and Election Authority, and also the National Elections Cybersecurity Center. So with that, let's hear from Brianna. Thank you, Brianna.
Thank you. Nice to see everybody virtually. It's been a while since I think we've been able to visit, even before this Omicron spike, but I really appreciate everything that Muleskinners has done to get the word out about poll workers, to get voting education out. It's so difficult, especially now with not having so many in-person meetings, that having announcements and continuing to have Zoom meetings and the ability for people to participate has been wonderful. We've been able to benefit from that by getting poll workers on an ongoing basis and just making sure that the elections can still happen. So I really, really appreciate all of that. And so I'm really glad to talk with everyone today. I am going to start out just by saying that I am not the world's leading expert on redistricting, but what I did want to go over was expectations on how redistricting affects the clerk's office, how it's going to affect voters, what the timeline is for it, and how that process works. So I did, way back in the beginning, before the announcements, put into the chat the link to the House districts. And for all intents and purposes, I'm going to focus on 2 entities of redistricting. So that's the houses, the state house lines, those districts, and the city of Columbia's lines. Because at the end of the day, for Boone County, those are the 2 that carve up Boone County the most. Other entities within Boone County, other cities, are not expecting to change very much or need to do any sort of redistricting at this point. Many of them are at large, and so there's really no wards to speak of. Sturgeon, for example, just eliminated their wards, so they are now all just at large. So the city lines are still where they are, but Sturgeon doesn't have to redistrict because they don't have any wards anymore. This is something that normally happens far earlier in the year. The late census and ability to look at the data has pushed all of it back, and it's led to a number of interesting outcomes for county clerks that we as an association have been trying to communicate to especially the state. Luckily, the House Redistricting Committee has moved very quickly and adopted their map, but for the Senate Redistricting Committee and also for the legislature, there are a number of administrative things that happen that really impact how we can adopt these maps. So from a very high level, you start with congressional redistricting, and then size-wise for affecting Boone County, you would go to the state Senate, and then you would go to the House districts. At this time, I don't really have any reason to believe that a congressional map would split up Boone County. So for all intents and purposes, let's say Boone County remains as a whole county. So we all end up in the same district. That's really not going to affect anybody. What district we end up in terms of voting for, whether we're in the 4th or something like that, that has a political impact. But for assigning a voter to get the correct ballot, all of Boone County will get the same person, the same candidate list on the ballot. Moving down to the state Senate, very largely the same thing. The maps that are out there now keep Boone County as its own Senate district. It would not be something that would be split up. So as long as that doesn't happen, then we're in the clear on that. Now, when you move to House districts, regardless of how it ends up as competitive or what have you, they are largely different lines than what we have now. If you compare them to the lines that we've had for the last 10 years, nearly all of them move in some way, shape, form, fashion, and that's going to be a big impact on how we make sure voters get the correct ballot. Depending on what happens with the city maps, that'll play into it as well. So the way that it works when we get these new maps is that we get them in a file format that we can use GIS for. So if you go to the link to look at and play around with the new house maps, that's a GIS capable system. So you can scroll around on it. It's looking at a very specific kind of data file, and it makes it really easy to see where the lines are, where the streets are, and you can tell where you live on them and all of that. We have that capability in our office. Most county clerks have some ability to use GIS in their offices, and we can take that map and we can overlay any other map that we need. So we will overlay the school district maps. We will overlay the city maps. All of those get overlaid so that we can make sure that the precinct lines, because the precincts exist for the purposes of making sure that people in individual areas are voting on the same things. So the precincts are essentially a consequence of all these different entities with different lines and maps coming together onto one map and then drawing within all of those different differences so that we know that everybody that lives in 1A, unless there is a split, gets to vote on the same thing. Everybody that's in 2C gets to vote on the same thing. So those are all decisions that get made once those lines are finalized and we can overlay them on each other. Where it becomes really tricky and the background for the clerk offices is those maps become the foundation for how we make sure that a voter's residence is tied to the right districts to get the correct ballot. Unfortunately, the database that we use to do that, which is provided by the state, is not a GIS capable system. So when we get all of these maps and we have all of this wonderful GIS data, we then have to translate it into address ranges. So instead of being able to kind of just import it into the system, we have to say from 200 to 301 Ash is in this district, but from 302 to 400 Ash is in this district. And that's what it looks like right now. And to be like, you know, way back when transparent, Wendy's system was also like that. The majority of voter registration databases have been based on address ranges because GIS really only took off in the last 10 years. So that's common practice. That's what we're used to. We have, as a clerks association, made that case to the Secretary of State's office and also to our legislators to let them know that this is something that isn't just as easy as plug and play. We can't just take these maps and put them in the system. This is a manual process that we're going to have to do. What makes it somewhat more complicated is because it's in a database that, of course, is being used to tie voters to where they need to be for elections. And we will have an April election. So once we activate the April election, which will happen next week after we get all of the entity information in of what's going to be on the ballot, that gets frozen in time. So I can't go in and move my districts around in that voter registration system because it's locked for the purposes of the April election. I can't just move things around because it may strand voters, it may have consequences, and so the system is set up to lock that in place. That stays locked until the April election is over. The April election, for all intents and purposes, is over 2 weeks after the April election because we have to wait until after certification. So we're looking at the system being freed up around April 15th, April 16th, something like that. Now, where it gets especially complicated is the August election then gets activated around Memorial Day. So we've got from the end of April to the end of May to be able to make any changes that we can possibly make to our address library. So that is the window of opportunity that we're looking at as clerks to put those maps into the statewide system. So from our office's perspective, although we are administrative, I mean, there's no policy implications for redistricting that come from our office. We're just the repository of these things. It does have a very big impact on how the election is going to be operated, depending on when we can get those maps into place. I am very grateful that the House Commission finished up their work because that's the one that I had really been waiting on. But that's uniquely to Boone. I mean, there are other counties that are going to have different congressional lines and different Senate lines. And so this is going to be an across the state impact on when we're going to be able to get this information into the statewide system. So that's going to be taking up a lot of our time in addition to running the April election and all of those kinds of things. That's how the process works on the back end, which I've just been trying to educate people on because lots of times people call our office about redistricting anyway. And it's always kind of surprising for people to hear that the biggest thing that we end up caring about is the timing of when the maps go in, not because, you know, we're concerned about candidate filing or things like that, but we're actually concerned about making sure voters are tied to the right areas to get the correct ballots. Because that's the worst possible thing that can happen is that somebody shows up at the polling place and have been assigned to the wrong district, the wrong precinct, by virtue of just having mapping information that's not correct. So it's definitely a multi-step process. We have lots of checks and balances to make sure that those things don't happen. And we have lots of sets of eyes on it. It's not just something that one person does and then we never look at it again. It gets reviewed a lot. And it's a process that we're used to. It's just that this doesn't usually happen so late in the game. In terms of, I know Alice had mentioned what impact the new lines will have. So when a candidate, I mean, candidates have announced intentions to run, but candidate filing doesn't open until the end of February right now. There may be, depending on how the redistricting process goes on the Senate and also on the congressional maps, there is some talk that the legislature might move the candidate filing deadline to account for that. If the candidate filing deadline moves, it'll be later in the year, closer to the August election. So that would kind of push that back. But right now, anybody that has said that they were running for any kind of legislative seat had to do it based on what they were thinking that the maps would be, or knowing what their district might be in the future. So that's definitely impacting people. I know that it's impacted one of the current state representatives for Columbia. In the more urban areas, there have been state reps that have been drawn into the same district. So now they're having to decide if they want to primary each other, which is always tricky as well. And that is all the usual part and parcel of a redistricting process. But it'll be something that affects candidates as they're trying to make determinations about whether they're going to run or not too. They do not at this time have to be, when they go to file, because all the maps are new, there's a grace period built in where you don't have to file for the district that you're in, but you have to move to that district, otherwise you won't be eligible. So there is a period of time, it's about a year, where you have to move into the district that you're going to represent, but you don't have to live there when you first file. So I know those are all things candidates have to keep into consideration when they're making those decisions, but that is a very quick and dirty way of how redistricting is going to be impacting people as candidates, and also how it ends up affecting our offices. It doesn't have any impact right now on the April elections because all of the cities have made their maps go into effect after the April election. So normally, the situation is that we get the city maps before the following April election as well, but with the late census data, we also didn't have that. So April elections stay exactly the same as they were in the past, but in 2023, new maps will be in effect for those. And I know that's just the redistricting portion, but I'm happy to talk about any of this. I kind of figured it would be productive as kind of a Q&A more than just talking about things, because the map is so new. The House map literally just came out on Wednesday. Otherwise, I'll also say Alice brought up my podcast, which is super fun if you are into elections administration like I am. But we have 60 episodes. It's called High Turnout, Wide Margins. But we have 60 episodes, and really the purpose of it was that Eric and I felt like a lot of the conversations about how elections were being run were not necessarily they weren't really including the voices of the people actually running them. And having worked in the Secretary of State's office, I really don't have a problem saying the Secretary of State's office doesn't know how elections are run, and they will readily say that too. I didn't know all of the minutia of the administration of every piece of the election when I was in the Secretary of State's office, because it's just not, it's a division of labor. There's nothing that the Secretary of State's office needs to know about conducting an election. They need to know about other things. They need to know about the logistics of initiative petitions and all the policies and procedures and things like that. But those often are the voices that you end up hearing about different types of proposals and how they might impact elections. And in the local election authority community, we obviously have our association for the state, but every state has some form of association. And that's where all of our information on best practices, any kind of new developments that are, really taking off in one place. For example, Colorado is one of the pioneers of risk limiting audits, which is just a form of audit that happens after the election as a part of certification. We did a pilot of that after the November special election. And that's because I was able to have these really good conversations with people in Colorado that have done them before. So it's a really important concept. Sharing information, collaboration in the local election community is really important. We weren't able to do it as much with COVID. And so the podcast is really just trying to serve as a fill-in for that kind of conversation. So if you would want to listen to a bunch of election administrators talking about better ways to do our jobs, that's what the episodes are about. I'm going to call on people. Pam had her hand raised.
Is anything happening with the law that didn't pass last year, maybe, about being able to vote absentee without an excuse?
So it is included in a number of pieces of legislation, including the ones that would be considered the pieces to watch. There's always legislation that gets introduced as little standalone things that don't get referred to committee and things like that. And then there's the ones that are kind of the vehicle of the election package of legislation that they're trying to make. This is a topic that has been included in almost every one of the vehicles. The Clerks Association has been pushing very hard to get no excuse absentee. What it looks like in almost every iteration of what's out there is that it would be no excuse in person. So it wouldn't necessarily open it up for no excuse mailing, but all of the legislation does include in-person no excuse voting. And there's some unknown about whether that would be a smaller amount of time than the regular 6 weeks absentee. If there would be 6 weeks of absentee with an excuse and 3 weeks of no excuse absentee in person, that may be kind of the package deal that comes out of it, or it may be a full 6 weeks. All of that is still kind of moving through the process, but it is one of the things that's on there. And then there's really just been a record number of election bills filed that kind of run the gamut from things like, you know, very specific equipment that they want us to buy to, you know, changing the way that we do our voter registration procedures. It's kind of everywhere right now. But what the Clerks Association is watching are these election package ones that are coming from the elections committee in the House right now.
Okay, thank you. Could you refresh our memory? What are the issues on the ballot in April?
So April will be the city council. So for Columbia, that's mayor, and then the third ward.
No, the issues. So the school bond issue.
Oh, I do not have those at the ready because they're not all due to us until next Tuesday.
Okay.
So we still have them trickling in. I got a couple new ones today. So there's quite a few issues that are going on. I know for sure there will be a countywide one on the Wayfair, which is the online sales tax. So both the county and city of Columbia will have that on. I want to say another city is also putting it on, but I don't know if they decided to or not. But those are the main things. And there will be some bond issues, but I am not sure about all of them yet.
Okay, thank you.
Carl had his hand up.
Yeah, Brianna, welcome to Muleskinners as usual. And your explication of redistricting was informative and thorough as usual as well. I've got a little bit more general question, and that question really has to do with the recent, I don't know, media assault on local election officials by certain quarters. And I was curious as to whether or not you've received any communications or have any comments about folks challenging the election process and the voting process in Columbia or anywhere else, for that matter, with respect to local election oversight of future elections.
So that is an excellent question. And from talking to peers in other states, it's very obvious that Missouri has been extremely fortunate in not facing, Missouri election authorities have been extremely fortunate in not facing threats and challenges that a lot of other communities have had to deal with. Arizona and Michigan are the two that come to mind that I have colleagues in that have had to hire security and have been in very extreme situations. We have not even immediately following the November election, we had people that called and thanked us and things, and the office was by and large very positive. I mean, we all felt very good about the November election. We have not had, you know, we've not had concerns brought to us from anybody. I know the Secretary of State's office has talked to people at a much higher level. It seems like a lot of the challenges that happen when they happen statewide, they go directly to the Secretary of State's office in a lot of ways. that's been very, we had a hearing, for example, on Wednesday. The Secretary of State's office was there. It was an informational hearing for the state Senate so that they could have some background from both our offices and the Secretary of State's office. Secretary of State's office very assertively said there was no widespread fraud that happened in the 2020 election, that he has confidence in the county clerks in the state. And that kind of rhetoric has been very helpful, both I think for our voters, but also for local election authorities to hear. David has his hand raised.
Yeah, just a quick one, and this may not be in your area. You mentioned the Wayfair tax earlier as an issue that's going to be in April, and then you explained that it's an online sales tax. Do you have any idea why they keep calling it a Wayfair tax? And Wayfair is just one online company, lots of other online companies. Why do they call it that instead of an online sales tax?
Oh, so for the Wayfair, it's because it's related to a court decision. So it's Wayfair versus, and I don't remember what it is, but that it ended up being the court decision, and that court decision allowed it to be on the ballot. And so that's been the shorthand for it. I don't exactly know why they decided that that was the shorthand for it, but if you read about it in the paper and things like that, that's why it's called Wayfair.
Thank you. All right, appreciate it.
Lyra has a hand raised.
Yeah, Brianna, I have a very specific question. You mentioned that Sturgeon was doing away with their wards. And for the Central Committee, which also faces elections for wards and township representatives, I believe they had 3 wards. What does that do for electing people to our Central Committee?
Yes, that was actually a question I had for them, because when they told us that they when they sent me the ordinance that their board had passed, I wanted to confirm that they meant that they were getting rid of wards for all intents and purposes and not just for the purpose of their April elections. They said that they are doing away with them completely. So I would, to be perfectly safe for you, I would say to talk to the state party just to confirm. My understanding is that it means that it eliminates the ability to elect anybody out of those wards, and it would go back to the township that Sturgeon is included in. But that is only my understanding from what I thought would happen. Yeah.
So effectively, it eliminates 6 committee person positions.
It's entirely possible, but I don't know for certain.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat. What do I think potential turnout will be? For, I guess, for the August and for the November. So presiding, and she noted, presiding commissioner, county auditor, and county treasurer will all be on the ballot. County treasurer will be on. I did want to make that point too, because there's been a lot of questions about that. So the governor will have a chance to appoint somebody into the county treasurer position now that there has been a resignation and a vacancy is created. But because it has happened so early in the term, it will be on the ballot for November of 2022. The odd little linchpin to that is if the governor makes his appointment before March 15th, then it will just go in candidate filing. People can sign up. It'll be on the August primary, then it'll go on the November ballot. If he does not make his appointment until after March 15th, it becomes like a special election, and the 2 committees get to make the choice of who is going to be the Republican and the Democrat that end up on the ballot in November. It will completely jump over August. So it all hinges on when the appointment's going to happen. So that's just for the treasurer. In terms of turnout for all of those things, we generally, even in off years, August elections end up being between 25 and 30% turnout. I don't know that we're really going to move off of that too much, because so much of it depends on what's happening at the top of the ticket. And it's still kind of early to determine what that's going to look like. The US Senate is the top of the ticket for this year. And so it may be really competitive by the time we get to August, or it may have already worked itself out, and that'll have a big impact on it. For November, for midterm elections, we usually hover in, the 55 to 60%. I'm hoping for 60%. Obviously, we exceeded expectations for 2020 and ended up about 1.5% higher than we normally are. So I'm hoping that that is a good sign and that people are engaged and are going to continue to be engaged. And we'll keep doing all the same things that we had done before that have seemed to have been helpful, if not in at least appreciated what we've heard for feedback, things like weekend opportunities for absentee voting. Carl has his hand raised.
Yeah, and not to violate any of your independence with regard, but this bears on the Wayfair question. And that is, I mean, the city prefers to consider that by nominally as the use tax. And we've gotten quite a bit of cooperation, not only from the Chamber of Commerce, but other municipalities in Boone County that intend to pursue this issue. But interestingly, just for the sake of discussion and for the members here who are tuned in, I had a phone call this morning suggesting that the Government Affairs Committee of the Chamber met on Thursday. Unfortunately, I regret not being able to be there. There were several folks there, and they were raising the objection that someone on the city council, although I don't remember this conversation, had raised the issue of Wayfair being with strings attached, or the use tax having strings attached to some homeless shelter issue, with those funds going to the general fund, but having stipulations that they had to be tied to a homeless shelter. Now, someone may have said that. There certainly is no nominal support, I don't believe, on the city council to do that. There may be some discussion about those funds, should they be granted, going to the general fund, but 2/3 of that is going to police and fire safety, public safety, and that may be the case. There may be some strings attached to that. But frankly, I have a call in for Matt McCormick at the chamber this morning to call me back to chat about this, because I really don't think we need these difficulties and splits in trying to advocate for the use tax when in fact this is just a matter of speculation at this point. Just so you know, I mean, this really doesn't bear on your independence, of course, and putting it on the ballot, and it will be on the ballot, but just a bit of background for what's going on at the moment. There is a committee being organized to advocate for the use tax, of course, in Columbia as we speak.
Looks like Pam has a question. I'm hoping that these go in rolling order. And I'm not leaving anybody out, but Pam has her hand raised.
Thank you, Brianna. I have been reading that young people are becoming much more engaged about voting. Are you seeing an increase in young people registration?
Registration at this point in the year is still relatively slow. So we haven't had anything in particular, but we have had, I've gotten emails from more student groups at different high schools, and certainly more questions, I think, from college students and from it's earlier in the year for some of these questions. Like, it's obvious that
Sure.
whether they're working on stories for school or they're just interested in them themselves, that they're paying attention earlier in the process than they used to. I don't think it.
So, okay, you can't tell yet. Thank you.
Changes of address for a lot of college students too. Sue and Herb have questions.
Yes, I have a question. It's quite related to
to Pam's question, Ms. Lennon. Do you know, in terms of recent history, the percentage of students who register here in Columbia? My understanding is that some students don't register here. They maintain their registration at home. But how many register here, and what percentage of them then participate in the local elections?
So registering here is a little bit tricky to tell because they tend to bounce back and forth. So there's a lot of St. Louis and Kansas City former residents that then come here for college. And you can see, especially now that we're on the statewide system, you can see that they bounce back and forth between election years where they register in St. Louis because they go home over the summer and they register back in Columbia when they come back. That's one of the challenges that we have in trying to make sure that college students know that there is a 4-week cutoff. And I have, at least anecdotally, when I've gone to go talk to the student organizations, met with a number of people that have said, you know, I just prefer to be registered in my hometown. So I don't have a great sense for percentage wise how many people make that decision where they are so more invested in their hometown that they would prefer to stay there. There are, for every election, there are always, we end up getting calls and stuff of people that are driving back and forth, and they will drive all, if they're registered in St. Louis and they thought they could still vote here, and I tell them, I'm sorry, you really can't, they'll drive to St. Louis and they'll go vote. So there's definitely a lot of committed students on campus. We saw, especially through the partnership with Mizzou last year with having the arena as a vote center for the November election, that made a really big difference. We had over 2,000 people come to vote at that, which was largely students. And I've started to see more administration take an interest in making sure that their students are registered to vote, which has been really wonderful. And I think that that'll make a big difference too. I think a lot of it is just that the voting, with the law being so decentralized, it's sometimes hard for students to figure out who they're supposed to come talk to in the first place, our office, and who they should be registered with, whether they have residency or not. And so we've been trying to build those relationships in other ways. For example, in order to prove residency for their tuition purposes, they can use a voter ID card. And so we've been trying to do those educational efforts to say, you know, hey, if you're looking to prove residency, registering to vote where you actually live most of the time, where you're saying you're a resident, is a great way to do that. And that helps make sure that we can get them good information through our sample ballots and everything to get them to vote. So I don't have, it's not a perfect answer because I don't have numbers and things like that, but I can tell you what it feels like when I'm talking to a lot of these students.
Sure. Well, it's a helpful answer.
Okay. It's actually not so much to you, Brianna. Thank you for your description. So, and trying to educate us. It's much more complicated than we tend to realize. And I will also say, I just said something to Herb, I think yesterday, that it wasn't until we had somebody that wasn't a good county clerk that I fully appreciated or could really appreciate why your job is so important. Because we got materially impacted by having to wait in line to vote for over 2 hours, which is minor compared to what so many other people had. But this was, what is it, 4D? Yeah, 4D. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to say, which is not so much related to you, but it is to the wayfarer tax. I was at a city council meeting and it came up about trying to spend some of the money, federal money coming in, and the same will be true with the wayfarer, trying to spend it for social service related, but homeless was mentioned. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks while I was listening to this public discussion, that homeless tends to be male, a very small population, and there is a huge seniors that is male and female, and there is a huge children and single women especially that have needs that are at least as great and can have a greater impact actually on the health of our community than just focusing on homeless. I just leave it at that. I'm just wanting to spread that kind of thinking that you just not say the homeless need the money. It's people that are kind of hidden, that don't come to city council, that you don't see on the street, that may be suffering just as much, if not worse. Can you take that off?
Scott, or did you have a question?
Brianna, let me ask a question. The rampant, overwhelming publicity given the Trumpers on vote fraud and stolen elections. I'm hearing and reading so much of it, and even talking to some friends who absolutely believe the Trump line that his election was stolen, that I'm concerned that it is a major issue, which is not going to go away. Now, from your county clerk associations, and you're visiting with those people across the state and across the nation, is there any evidence among, in your office, any of the offices across Missouri or across the state, of any actual voter fraud? That is, anybody voting who isn't supposed to on purpose, anybody fraudulently trying to register somebody else, or anything that would be other than a few isolated incidents of which we are all aware of, or isolated mistakes, and I'm sure there's some of those, anything that would be anywhere beyond the insignificant criteria that might affect an election. What are your thoughts on that? First, is it a major issue? Is it not? Am I misreading what I'm reading in the Wall Street Journal, even the New York Times and the Washington Post, and listening to people talk? Or what's your take on it? If that's a fair question. If you don't want to answer it, that's okay.
No, it's a very fair question. It's one that is highly concerning for every election official right now. So to answer your first question, there is no systemic fraud that is taking place. What we as a clerks association have been trying to do, and we were actually at the Capitol on Wednesday to try to do this, is really ramp up our education efforts for policymakers and people that we know are hearing these concerns, and the individuals that are alleging some sort of voter fraud that are going and talking directly to state representatives. So we're educating them on the checks and balances approach from the administrative side of how absentee voting works. We're educating them on all of the checks that we do after election day. We're encouraging people to be poll workers. I know that was in the chat earlier, to see how the process works, because when we have challengers and watchers, which we only ever have during presidential election years, there's always a large number of them that leave the polls early because it's not very exciting. When you actually see how the process works, it's meant to be boring. It's meant to be a very bureaucratic system of making sure that all of the numbers match up, making sure that everybody signs where they're supposed to sign, that they check the tamper evidence seals, and that the whole process has reconciliation at the end of the day, so that we know that those things are all working properly, and then there was no problems or mistakes that happened. So part of the conversations when we ourselves talk to people that are concerned about fraud, in explaining that does debunk a large portion of what they're talking about. We've heard very recently that they think that a lot of the fraud has been that the votes have been flipped to themselves because there's some sort of electronic transmission. That's just a fundamental misunderstanding of the way the process works. Everything is on paper when we send it to the Secretary of State's office. Everything is on paper when the voter casts a ballot. And everything that we do that is electronic is checked against paper because we don't use the electronic results as the final official results of any election. So all those processes, I think, make assumptions that things can happen. And because there's so little knowledge of how the process works, even though it's decentralized and everybody in every state is doing something slightly different, at the end of the day, we all are doing some sort of check and balance, some sort of certification, even if it's a little bit different. And we can all confidently point to those as the record of the election with a chain of custody to be able to have those conversations. Maricopa is a great example where they did all of that and now it doesn't matter. I mean, the narrative continues on even though that education has happened. That is more worrisome, where, you know, no matter what we say, there's going to be a certain segment of the population that does not believe it, even when we put the proof in front of them, even when they look at the counts and the hand counts and the hand audits and everything else. The goalposts just move to a different thing. You know, like that there's an issue with the voter registrations. Like the conversation started with, well, the vote counting was bad. Well, we've all pretty much debunked that the vote counting wasn't bad. And the machines themselves all had vote counting checks with hand counting with bipartisan teams. So anything that we have heard has now been shifted to say, well, you know, we need to put all these extra checks on the system. If you look at a lot of the legislation that's been filed, it's to quote unquote fix those problems, but it's actually just talking about things we already do. There's bills in place that just duplicate efforts that we already do to make sure that everything is secure, because there's just a lack of information of the stuff we already do to make sure things are secure. So right now, I will say our association, everything that we're working on, that's all based on getting good, accurate information in the hands of the people that are making decisions so that they can also educate the people that they have as stakeholders, and that we can have a better conversation about things that we really can improve and make a difference for voters on, like no excuse absentee voting.
Thank you.
Sue, you have.
It's me this time. Congratulations on your national appointment. I think it's wonderful in the tradition of some very good county clerks we have in the main, with exception, had here in Boone County. I have a question for you in that capacity. You recited to us the challenges associated with the late census, the plethora of other issues coming at you, and the extreme delays, which it looks to me as if imposed upon county clerks collectively in Missouri. You have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment when you haven't been tried, much less convicted, and conviction is prohibited in the U.S. Constitution. Does it appear to you from your new national position that in other states, the high mucky mucks in other states hate county clerks as much as they seem to here in Missouri?
I will say we do all feel like we're in a very similar position, especially with redistricting. And there are some, I mean, it's another thing that I'm very happy to be in Missouri for. There are some states that are really going after election authorities in much more pointed ways by creating systems of demerits, where if somebody does something they don't like, then that county clerk gets a demerit. They're losing their immunity that comes with their position so that they can be prosecuted personally, which is just completely mind-boggling to me that you would do that. So by and large, we are very lucky. There are definitely colleagues of mine that are having a much rougher time. So I count my blessings. Yana has a question in the comments. Do folks who believe there is fraud Do they not realize it would affect them all? Actually, yeah, that is something that comes up pretty often. That's a conversation that I hear. I haven't, I hear other people having it where you can't just pull out one race from a ballot and say only that race had fraud because they're all on the same ballot and they all got tabulated the same way and they all get checked the same way. That has been, like when I mentioned the moving the goalpost, there have been these allegations that it really has just been one race that has been targeted. There's no way to systematically do that. So that's been pretty well debunked. But it is something that comes up that is not lost in the conversation. Carl, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate your assurances in the redundancy that a paper trail provides. Is there anyone anywhere else in the United States in various state jurisdictions that do just rely on electronic ballots without any redundancy, without any trail of sorts, or is that just a fantasy?
Oh no, there have been. They've all been moving in that direction. So the underlying issue for all of this paper ballot push has been that after the 2000 election, and then HAVA going into effect in 2002, the big push at the time, the really popular thing at the time was, well, clearly paper is our biggest liability because it led to the hanging chads. And so we should move away from that. We have great technology. We'll move to touchscreens, and everybody use touchscreens and you won't have to worry about it. Missouri was very prescient at the time and added in to its implementation of HAVA that we had to have a paper trail, whether that was by actual paper ballots that got read by an optical scan, or some counties like St. Louis County used to just have touchscreens, but it would have a roll of paper on the side that would keep track of all of the things. Not every state did that. Georgia is a great example. Right before the 2020 election, Georgia changed from having completely electronic voting, which the voters themselves had been fine with it. I mean, in all these cases, the voters have just accepted it and done it, no big deal. In some places in Texas as well. And then the county clerks and the policymakers realized, wow, we really need to have some paper. And so they moved in that direction. The biggest issue and the reason why they've done that is because you could never audit something on technology. And so there have been some states that have been able to increase the integrity of their audits too by doing that, not just like the voters' confidence that, hey, we have this on paper, but hey, we have this on paper and we can check it, and so we can have a good chain of custody. There's a really good, and I'll find it for you, but there's a really good map that Verified Voting does of all of the different voting equipment that is used in the state or in the whole country, and keeps it up to date to like within a week of when the equipment was bought. Like when we bought equipment in 2019, I got an email from them like 2 weeks later, hey, we heard that you bought new equipment. What kind of model is it? What does it do? So we can add it to our map. So there's people out there watching. Alice has her hand raised.
So Brianna, have you ever considered recently trying to bring on ambassadors to help with voter education through the clerk's office? I know that kind of like for vaccine outreach, the health department does this. And I know the league as well as Boone County Dems, we do voter registration outreach, but there may be people who would rather be part of the clerk's office doing that. And is that something you've considered with all the headaches it might involve? And I do remember when I first came to Boone County, I was some kind of voter outreach registration person through the clerk's office.
Yeah, so there's that. I'll answer both questions with one answer. So the ambassador type thing for voter registration is a system that exists in statute. And I was just talking to the league about this on Wednesday. I get the sense that the reason why it's included in the statute is because the ability to register a voter used to be extremely narrow. You had to be affiliated with the county clerk's office, or you had to be the county clerk's office. You couldn't just take a piece of paper from our office, go give it to your friend and say, here you go, just fill this out and send it back. So that accountability was there. There are some counties that still really utilize it and bring people in and give them a training and send them out into the world and do that. They're usually the larger ones like St. Louis County and Jackson County. But it's a good question and one that I have thought about regarding ambassador type things. We've been trying to, we kind of started in 2020 and doing some outreach, but we have, I do have somebody on my staff that has been very helpful in just trying to make sure that different groups and entities that are having events are aware that we have resources that we can give them. We've tried to create a number of flyers and informational pamphlets and online resources that people can share. So we haven't done anything formal, but that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
And I dropped into the chat the map of all of the different voting equipment. I've forgotten, it actually goes all the way back to 2006. So you can track in time as the counties went from electronic to back to paper to electronic, then back to paper again. David, you have a question?
I just jumped over, looking at that map you just shared. There are a lot of acronyms on it. Is there somewhere on the map that tells what a BMD is, what a DRE or a VVPAT?
Yes, if you scroll down a little bit from the actual map, it has little at a glance questions. And so it talks about, and for reference, like I said, it had moved from electronic. There are different flavors of each of these. You always have to have some sort of touchscreen from the ADA perspective. You have to have some sort of touchscreen. We've elected to deploy them for every election because it's not just people that have disabilities that like to use this equipment. It's helpful in a lot of different ways. So the new type of touchscreen, the old ones used to actually tabulate your ballot. So at the end of the night, the poll workers would have to take all of the memory cards from the touchscreen and the memory card from the optical scan, add those together. That would be the tabulation. Now the ballot marking devices really serve, I hate to say it this way, this is what people call it, but they call it just like a 25-pound pencil, because that's what it is. You're using it in place of using a pen, and then it prints out what your selections are, and then you can look at them and then you feed it into the tabulator so that the one tabulator ends up being the only one that all of the ballots go into. But you also have a paper ballot for every single voter, regardless of whether they use a touchscreen or hand mark their paper ballot. So that's like the new flavor of touchscreen, and it's more, it's what pretty much everybody in Missouri has some version of by now. We've all the counties have, except for I think 2, which are in the process of buying new equipment, moved over from the DREs, which were the tabulating electronic touchscreens, to the ballot marking devices. I feel like I've talked a long time. Does anybody else have any questions?
I think our time is officially up. If we have, maybe I'll squeeze in one more before Brianna has to get back to work. Any other questions for her? Scanning over, looking.
Say something about the postcards at the office. I haven't had a chance to put them in the announcements yet. There are packets of 10 postcards. They're going to people who are 90% Democrats and did not vote in the municipal election. And there is a sample message that you can write to them. It has been proven in the past when people get a personal message in the mail that they will tend to follow through. So hopefully this will increase the number of people voting in the municipal election, and then they continue on and vote in the other elections. Then later on, there will be also postcards for the general election, because there have been people who are 90% Democrats who don't vote in the general election. And Debbie told me yesterday that there were 5,000 people in Boone County who are 90% Democrat and did not vote in the municipal election. So hopefully we will get our number of people up, and you'll have room on there. Actually, I was thinking about putting a sentence on.
Pam,
Yes,
let's do this not with Brianna. It's better not to have it when we're supposed to be more on a
okay.
bipartisan.
It's important to keep Brianna isolated from this.
Yeah, sure. Okay, sorry.
Well, include the information from Maury to pass on for announcements, if you will, and then we'll be reminding people of it. Thank
Yeah.
you. Any other announcements or questions for Brianna before she has to slip away?
No, just thank
All right,
you.
well, thank you for that, Pam.
Thank you
And in
for a
that case-
splendid program, Brianna.
Thank you very much, Brianna. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Always
Thanks
like
for
to come.
stepping in at the last
I hope
minute.
you've seen all the nice comments in chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
You
Our
all are
county
too
clerk.
kind.
Thank you very much.
We are so lucky to have you.
We're proud of you.
Very proud of you.
Remember, next week, our speaker will be Monica Naylor. So come on back next Friday
Bye,
and we'll see you
Brianna.
all then. Thanks a lot. Have a great week.